Picture the American Old West, heroic cowboys, blazing gunfights, and a vast, untamed frontier calling to the bold. But strip away the Hollywood shine, and what's left is a brutal, filthy reality far from romantic. For most, life wasn't a thrilling adventure. It was a relentless grind of survival, steeped in backbreaking, stomach-churning work. The epic tale of westward expansion rested on the shoulders of those who toiled in dangerous, degrading, and downright disgusting jobs. The famous smell of manifest destiny wasn't pine trees and campfires. It was a foul mix of garbage, waste, and pervasive body odor, especially in the new unregulated towns and work camps. Today we're peeling back the romantic veneer to look at the harsh reality. We are going to explore 7 of the most disgusting jobs that someone had to do in the Old West. These were not jobs for the faint of heart or for the weak of stomach. If you enjoy uncovering the real stories of the Old West, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into history. Number 1. The miner. The dream of striking it rich drew thousands of men into the dark, dangerous underworld of the frontier mines. But the reality was a nightmare of disease and danger. A miner's job was to blast and haul rock from deep underground, often in cramped, unstable tunnels with barely enough air to breathe, and the air itself was poison. Miners constantly inhaled fine dust from coal and rock, leading to black lung disease and silicosis, which slowly and painfully destroyed their lungs. But it wasn't just dust. The underground air was often a toxic soup of lead, mercury, and arsenic, alongside deadly odorless gases like methane and carbon monoxide. It was a daily assault on their health. Beyond the poison air, the conditions were filthy. Personal hygiene was a luxury few could afford. In the squalid mining camps, bathing was a rare and difficult ordeal. Nearby streams were often polluted by the mine's own toxic runoff. This lack of cleanliness, combined with crowded quarters, was a breeding ground for disease. Imagine the stench of unwashed bodies crammed into a tight space, with clothes stiff from layers of sweat and grime. Accidents were terrifyingly common. Miners faced a daily risk of being crushed by fallen rock, maimed by equipment, or horrifically burned in gas explosions. Fellow miners were often the first responders, forced to deal with the gruesome aftermath of mangled bodies and unimaginable carnage. It was a life of constant fear, filth, and physical torment, all for the slim hope of finding wealth in the dark. Number 2. The buffalo skinner. In the latter half of the 19th century, the great buffalo herds that roamed the plains were nearly wiped out. And at the heart of this ecological disaster was the buffalo skinner. Their job was to follow the hunting outfits and strip the hides from the thousands upon thousands of slaughtered animals. The hunters were brutally efficient, sometimes killing hundreds of buffalo in a single stand. The skinners worked on killing fields that stretched for miles, a landscape of death that transformed the prairie into an open-air slaughterhouse. One witness, Colonel Richard Dodge, described the plains as a dead, solitary, putrid desert, where the air was foul with sickening stench. That stench would have been overpowering and inescapable, a constant companion for the skinners. The physical work itself was incredibly laborious. They had to cut and pull the heavy hides in constant, intimate contact with blood, fat, and decomposing flesh that was often teeming with maggots. Imagine toiling under the hot prairie sun covered in animal grease, with the air thick with flies and the smell of mass decay, and the waste was almost beyond comprehension. The hunters and skinners were usually only after the hide, which was worth about $3, and sometimes the tongue. Millions of tons of bison meat and carcasses were simply left to rot where they fell. The skinners were the frontline workers in this monumental desecration, their disgusting labor, a key part of an enterprise that reshaped the American West forever. Number 3, the slaughterhouse worker. As America's cities grew, so did the demand for meat. This gave rise to massive industrial slaughterhouses, especially in places like Chicago, which became known as the hog butcher for the world. For the men and women working inside, life was a high-speed assembly line nightmare of constant carnage. On the killing floors, animals were unceremoniously jerked off their feet by chains and hoisted into the air where their throats were slit. The air was filled with an appalling symphony of terrified squeals. Blood was everywhere. It gushed from the animals, pooled on the floors until it was knee-deep, and splattered the workers from head to toe. The drive for profit meant that hygiene was completely ignored. Rotten beef was treated with chemicals to hide the smell. Meat that fell onto the filthy floors, which were covered in dirt, sawdust, and spit, was simply picked up and tossed back into the processing line. Dead rats were reportedly swept from the floor directly into the sausage meat grinders. Workers suffering from tuberculosis coughed blood onto the floors right next to the meat. The conditions were just as hazardous. Laborers toiled in vile stenches and unbearable heat. In the winter, the workrooms were often unheated, and workers would sometimes stick their frozen feet inside the steaming carcasses of freshly killed cattle just to get warm. Sharp knives, slippery floors, and rampant disease made injury and illness a constant threat for the workers who processed America's food. Number 4, the tannery worker. Turning raw animal hides into leather was an essential industry in the Old West, but it was also one of the most foul-smelling and hazardous jobs imaginable. Tannery workers were immersed in a world of potent stenches, dangerous chemicals, and filth. The process began with raw hides that often arrived in a state of decomposition, crawling with flies and vermin. Workers had to soak these slimy hides and scrape off the remaining flesh and fat by hand. After that, the hides were soaked in vats of strong chemicals like lime solutions and tannic acid to prepare them for tanning. These vats were filled with murky, stinking liquids. Workers' hands and arms were constantly raw and irritated from being submerged in these caustic solutions. The entire tannery and the surrounding town were permeated by a constant, overwhelming stench of curing leather and stagnant waste. Tanneries were also major polluters. The waste from the process, flesh, hair, and chemical liquors, was often discharged directly into nearby rivers and streams, turning them into open sewers. It was described as one of the most noxious and hazardous industries of the era. The workers endured these disgusting conditions for long hours and low pay to produce the leather that was essential for saddles, boots, and belts on the frontier. Number 5, the bullwhacker. Before railroads crisscrossed the West, the job of hauling heavy freight fell to the bullwhacker or teamster. These men drove long teams of oxen or mules, walking beside them for hundreds of miles on dangerous trails like the Santa Fe Trail. It was a life of relentless hardship and exposure to filth. The food they ate was often abysmal. One bullwhacker wrote that only a stomach capable of digesting feathers in a wad could survive the meals. Their water was even worse. It was often sourced from buffalo wallows or muddy puddles. To make matters worse, the animals themselves would wade into these same water holes, contaminating the already disagreeable fluid with their waste. This meant a daily diet of bad food washed down with muddy, dung-filled water. The life of a bullwhacker was one of constant exposure to the elements. They walked from sunup to sundown, perpetually coated in the thick dust kicked up by their animals and wagons, or caked in mud after a rainstorm. Opportunities to wash were almost non-existent. And of course, managing a large team of animals meant constant, unavoidable contact with animal waste. Campsites and trails were littered with dung. The work was incredibly strenuous. The pay was low, and the conditions were vile. Yet without the thankless toil of these men, the vital flow of goods and supplies that allowed the West to grow would have come to a standstill. Number 6. The laundress. In the male-dominated world of the frontier U.S. Army, there was an officially recognized role filled almost exclusively by women, the company laundress. Often the wives of enlisted soldiers, these women performed the monumental task of washing the clothes for an entire company of men, all by hand. They handled laundry that was beyond just dirty. Soldiers' uniforms were caked with mud, grime, sweat, and often blood or other bodily fluids from injuries and illnesses. In an era when diseases like cholera and dysentery were common in army posts, this clothing was a potential carrier of deadly germs. The work itself was backbreaking. The main cleaning agent was harsh lye soap, which the laundresses often had to make themselves from wood ash and animal fat. This soap would have been incredibly tough on their skin. The process involved hauling heavy buckets of water, scrubbing each item on a rough washboard, boiling the clothes in huge tubs, and then wringing out the heavy waterlogged wool uniforms by hand. This grueling labor was often performed outdoors, with no shelter from the blazing sun, freezing cold, or driving rain. While they were provided with quarters, they were often little more than tents or crude shacks. Their essential work kept the Army running by maintaining basic hygiene, but it came at a tremendous physical cost. Number 7. The undertaker's assistant. On the frontier, death was a constant presence, and dealing with the deceased was a necessary but grim task that fell to the local undertaker and their assistants. Before modern embalming became common, this work was a profoundly disgusting and challenging occupation. The most repulsive part of the job was confronting the natural process of decay. Without modern preservation methods, bodies would begin to decompose rapidly, especially in the heat. This meant undertakers had to wash and dress bodies that were bloated, discolored, and purging fluids, all while enduring the sickly, sweet smell of decay. Before the widespread use of formaldehyde, bodies often had to be buried within a few days before the rot became unbearable. The Old West was also a violent place. Undertakers were the ones who had to handle the aftermath. They dealt with bodies that were mangled from accidents or bore horrific wounds from gunfights. Their job was to clean the bodies and try to make them presentable for a viewing, a psychologically taxing and stomach-turning task. This work was often done in primitive conditions, sometimes in a back room of the undertaker's furniture shop, using rudimentary tools. These early undertakers handled the dead who had succumbed to contagious diseases like smallpox and cholera, placing themselves at great personal risk. Their grim work provided a crucial service, managing the dead and allowing communities to grieve with some small measure of dignity. The story of the Old West is more than just cowboys and outlaws. It's the story of the miners, the skinners, the laundresses, and the countless others who did the dirty, dangerous, and disgusting jobs that made westward expansion possible. Their labor, however unpleasant, was the bedrock upon which the frontier was built. They are the unsung, forgotten figures who paid the true price of progress. Which of these jobs do you think was the absolute worst? And are there any other harsh frontier jobs you think should be on this list? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.